Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Lauren Ortiz. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with HENRI COLE, presenting his new collection of poetry, Blizzard, in conversation with Hannah Eizenman. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. We're hosting 5 events a week right here on Zoom. And just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Blizzard on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these last few months, technical difficulties may arise. So if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I am delighted to introduce our speakers. HENRI COLE is the author of over half a dozen previous collections of poetry, including Touch and Pierce the Skin, and a memoir, Orphic Paris. He has received many awards for his work, including the Jackson Poetry Prize, the Kingsley Tufts Award, the Rome Prize, the Berlin Prize, and the Award of Merit Medal in Poetry from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He teaches at Claremont McKenna College. Hannah Eizenman is the poetry coordinator at The New Yorker and holds an MFA from New York University. Originally from Birmingham, Alabama, she lives and writes in Brooklyn. Tonight, they'll be discussing HENRI's new book, Blizzard, the 10th collection of poetry from a master of, as Craig Morgan Teicher says, his own version of the sonnet, a compact lyrical utterance that drills down on a single experience, moment, or startled vision and surprises with every line. With tenderness and honesty, straddling classic and contemporary verse, he transmutes our anxious present into something lovelier. Louise Gluck says, when a poet of extraordinary gifts makes a profound change, it is an event for the art itself. Blizzard is such an event. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, HENRI and Hannah.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. I want to thank the Harvard Bookstore and Hannah for helping me launch and celebrate my book. I want to also thank my Claremont McKenna students who let me off the hook tonight. I was supposed to be teaching them in about 7 minutes. So I hope they're all watching as well tonight. And I'm going to read 5 poems from my book, Blizzard. And then I look forward to conversing with Hannah, whom I've just met today, by the way, after having some correspondence over the years. When I titled the book Blizzard, I was trying to express an overwhelming sense of feeling more than a meteorological event. And that was the idea behind the title. I hope you'll all like the cover image, which I also want to say is done by Charlie Gross, the late Charlie Gross, who died about 1.5 years ago now. And he was a friend, and it makes me happy to have his picture on my book. So I think I'm going to begin with this poem called Lingonberry Jam. These 5 poems I'm going to read are all shortish poems I think of as free verse sonnets, which is to say that they're not rhymed and they're not metered, but they have in them the sort of fractures and leaps and resolutions in them. Let's see, is that too much light? Maybe. They have the sort of fractures and leaps and resolutions in them that the sonnet form encourages or enables. This is a poem for a friend out west, Lingonberry Jam. What a wondrous thing to suddenly be alive, eating Natalie's lingonberry jam from Alaska, where she picked the fruit herself with one seeing eye. In this tumultuous world we're living in, with the 1 hour news loop, my thoughts linger more and more on the darkest side as I sit at the table with Mr. and Mrs. Spork, who still ask me, "Are you married yet?" But Natalie's lingonberry jam pierces right through into some deep, essential place where I am my own master and no sodomy laws exist, and where, like a snowflake or a bee lost amid the posies, I feel autonomous, blissed out, and real. This is my first virtual reading, so it's it's exciting, I have to say. In this socially distanced world we're living in, I think it's good to be able to still connect this way. And thank you all for joining tonight and helping me connect in this way. This is a poem called To a Snail. Like flesh or consciousness inhabited by flesh, willful, bold, très chic. The skin on your gelid body is brownish from age and secretes viscid slime from your flat, muscular foot, like script, as if Agnes Martin had wed Caravaggio, and then, after rainfall, you ran away, crossing a wet road with Fiats rushing past. Where is your partner? Contemplating your tentacles in house, gliding on a trace of mucus from some dark stone to who knows where. Why do I feel happiness? It's a long game, the whole undignified, insane attempt at living. So I've relocated you to the woods. Some of the poems in the collection look back to the 1980s when I lived in New York. It, it was the beginning of the AIDS crisis, really. It was a different kind of pandemic. There wasn't really a rush for a vaccine, and people didn't die quickly. They sort of lingered for months and years in a very painful way. This is a poem called Keep Me. I found a necktie on the street, a handmade silk tie from an Italian designer. Keep me, it pleaded from the trash. There's probably a story it could tell me of calamity days long ago. Then yesterday, tying a Windsor knot around my neck, I heard voices. Why have you got that old tie on? Suddenly Mason, Roy, Jimmy, and Miguel were pulling at my arms, like it was the 80s again, a darksome decade with another hard right president. My lips were not yet content with stillness. We were on our way home from a nightclub. I adore you, Miguel moaned, but have to return now. Remember, death ends a life, not a relationship. Well, this is a poem that appeared in the New Yorker. Hannah helped me see it into print. It's called On Friendship. I think it's self-explanatory. Lately, remembering anything involves an ability to forget something else. Watching the news, I writhe and moan. My mind is not itself. Lying next to a begonia from which black ants come and go, I drink vodka. Night falls. This seems a balm for wounds that are not visible in the gaudy daylight. Sometimes a friend cooks dinner. Our lives commingle. In loneliness, I fear me, but in society, I'm like a soldier kneeling on soft mats. Everything seems possible, as when I hear birds that awaken at 4 a.m. or see a veil upon a face. Beware, the heart is lean red meat. The mind feeds on this. I carry on my shoulder a bow and arrow for protection. I believe whatever I do next will surpass what I have done. I think I'll read just one more called Kayaking on the Charles. Well, I should say I'm reading to you from my little office in my apartment in the South End of Boston, where I have lived for 26 years. When I arrived here, I was a young lecturer at Harvard, and I had almost nothing. And now, well, I wish you could see all the clutter all around me. It's quite something. But that map on the wall was one of the very first things I bought when I arrived here. And the Charles River is about a mile this way. Kayaking on the Charles. I don't really like the ferries that make the water a scary vortex, or the blurry white sun that blinds me, or the adorable small families of distressed ducklings that swim in a panic when a speedboat cuts through, spewing a miasma into the river. But I love the Longfellow Bridge's towers that resemble the silver salt and pepper canisters on my kitchen table. They belong to Mother. The Department of Transportation is restoring the bridge masonry now. Paddling under its big arches, I feel weary as memory floats up, ignited by cigarette butts thrown down by steel workers. I want to paddle away too. Flies investigate my bare calves, and when I slap them hard, I realize they are so happy. I'm their amusement. Sometimes memories involve someone I loved. A rope chafes a cleat. I want my life to be post-pas de deux now. Lord, look at me, hatless with naked torso, 60-ish, paddling alone upriver. Thank you. So Hannah.
Oh, I couldn't see that I was back on the screen. That was a beautiful reading. I don't know if you could hear, but I was applauding.
Thank you.
Henri, this book is so beautiful. Congratulations on Blizzard. And thank you so much for inviting me to help you launch it. I'm really excited to talk about it. And I wanted to start, I think the last two poems you read kind of particularly lead into this theme that I wanted to ask about. It's a theme I notice in the collection. I notice you've observed it in your work before. And I think it's one that probably hits close to home for a lot of readers right now in this time of social distance when we're all speaking over Zoom and not quite in the same place, but trying to be anyway. And that's the theme of loneliness, or maybe solitude, if you see that as something different, which is something that I think in your work contrasts with the very powerful themes of friendship and society, kind of communal living. But I felt really moved and energized while I was reading this collection by the notion of loneliness or solitude as a generative or a potentially kind of subversive state. And I'm interested in how you think about loneliness in poetry. Do you see poetry as a way, especially in this time when we are all so separate, to escape loneliness, or is it a way to kind of write into that loneliness and to inhabit it? And if so, I guess I wonder what is to be found there.
Oh, that's such a good question. It reaches in many directions for me. I think poetry is sort of a salve for loneliness, or I think for me a lyric poem is a single voice speaking to another single voice. I was saying to my students the other night, I have a shell on the shelf here. I use the shell as a prop, and I wanted my students to think of their poems as a voice, their voice speaking and connecting to another voice. I can only speak for my experience. I can't speak for mankind in any way. So that's my definition of lyric. I also think about my French relatives, and we used to quarrel because I think, let's see, in French you can say, I feel alone, I am alone, but you can't say something as bald as I am a loner, he's a loner, they would say célibataire. And this was something, they struggled with, because I think the French culture is so much more a culture of togetherness. But no, I think, I also think of a teacher I once had, Mark Strand, who said that being a writer was like being in a room in which there was a loud party going on next door to which you were not invited, and you were alone in your room at your table. And I kind of like that as well. But I think my life as a writer kind of prepared me for confinement in a good way. I feel lucky to have email and the telephone, electronic connection for sure. It's funny, loneliness seems to have a darker cast to it than solitary. And I think I am not lonely, but I am a solitary person, if I can make that distinction.
I think it is, I think that's Marianne Moore who says that solitude is the antidote to loneliness, right? That when you can learn how to be I had the same sort of experience at the beginning of quarantine that, of course it was lonely and felt confined to be in my house, but I felt that as writers and as readers, you know, we're kind of practiced in finding community in solitude, right? Reading and writing are solitary acts, but they're also acts that connect you to something else. And so I think, that practice is certainly something that's come in handy.
I feel grateful for, you know, a half dozen people have nurtured me through the last 6 months, you know, through Zoom and telephone and email, and I'm very grateful to them for staying connected to me. You know, many people are committed to families and extended families, but so I'm just grateful.
Absolutely.
I hope it will end soon, though.
Oh, me too. I'm ready to get out in a crowd. The feeling of being alone in a crowd, there's really nothing like that, and it is something I miss. I would say.
Oh, I just want to hug my friends at the end of the night after dinner.
Oh, I know.
Say goodnight. So
that feeling of touch. So that's actually something else that I wanted to talk about. I think that idea of a poem as a single voice speaking to another single voice or to a single ear is something that is so beautiful and intimate and tender. And I think it's something that in Orphic Paris, your memoir, you describe poetry as connecting my inner and outer space. It is this kind of bringing of something intimate or interior into an exterior place. It's also something that I see in Blizzard. I'm thinking about the poem Goya, which is one that I love, where you write, "If I want the truth, I must seek it out. The line between the inner and outer erodes." And I think in that poem, we have a speaker who's looking at something, who's having the inner experience of observing a work of art. But I think this whole collection is also very much about the poet as an observer and about the act of perception, something that is active and something that transforms really what you see. And so I wonder if you could talk, the poems here are they have really kind of a painterly quality to me, almost like that they, the act of looking, but that is very active. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the role of visual art and especially of painting in your work, if there are painters who are really important to you, or art works or movements, and also maybe what you think a poem can do that a painting can't do, or vice versa, or what they have in common.
Yes. Well, again, those are all very interesting, nuanced questions. Where to begin? I think in Orphic Paris, I think I do actually say a difference between a painting and a poem is that in a poem, you can say, he is still living, but in a painting, you can't really say that. You can capture a moment. We're living in a moment in which we hear so loud the voices of politicians, the voice of the radio, the voice of the TV, the voice of dictators or putative presidents. We hear all of these voices, and the voice of poetry is really a whole different voice. And that's why, I think it's unkillable. It's as long as we have, inward imaginations, we'll seek out this voice of connection. Visual art is a way in which I have been nurtured forever. I'm a, frustrated artist, and I've been lucky to have friends that are artists. And I think there is some cross-fertilizing both ways. I get a lot of ideas. I get titles, all sorts of titles from paintings across the centuries. Or I riff on paintings. I try and inhabit, to escape myself, I try and inhabit a painting and enter the world of the painting and write outside of myself and in the world of the painting. I envy artists the physicality of their work. I'm like a little, like that snail crossing the road, and I envy the, the physicalness of making art. I wish there was more physicalness of making poems. But.
I think poetry is something that happens in the body. I think it's something that not only in sound and in breath, but also in, that's one thing. I mean, I think in the kind of painterly quality of your sonnets is that there is such texture in the language. When I was reading the book, I couldn't help but like read things out loud because they just sound so delightful. But also, in the look of a poem on a page, that all of that is physical. But I think that question of time is also an interesting one. That in a painting, you can't really illustrate time, the passage of time in the same way.
Yes. And I think you have to be careful of the eyes, because the eyes seek continual stimulation in the writing. And, I think there is maybe some writing today that is too much about that visual stimulation. And, the poem has to be pulled back into its primary emotion, away from this, kind of pretty description, you might say. When I was a younger man, I did write more descriptive poems than I do now. I decided at some point to try and pull out as much of that extraneous stuff as possible. So while the eye isn't important to me, the eyes are important to me, and observation and description are a part of my poems. I think there are less, if you were going to take an MRI of my poems, there would be less description than there was at the beginning, much less.
I think that's probably true. And they also seem to kind of, I think that a lot happens in the transitions in work, not the just one idea or the next idea, but the getting from idea to idea. But I think that idea of sight is something that is really interesting, that kind of is a thread throughout your work. I think about the first poem in Blizzard, which is Face of the Bee, where we kind of have the speaker seeing himself or imagining himself being seen by this bee that he encounters. And in that poem you write, no one is truly the owner of his own instincts, but controlling them. This is civilization. And I think that throughout the collection and throughout your poems, I think in To a Snail, which you read, there is this kind of tension. There's a fascination with the natural world, with the animal world, with those kinds of impulses, but also with these patterns that are that really govern that world. I think there's another poem about mushrooms that describes them, I want to say, palatal wastework, maybe is the phrase. And I think that the understanding that seeing those patterns that you might see in art, but also seeing them in nature, and also that chaos and that kind of that tension between control and abandon, between brutality and beauty. It made me think of something that you say also in Orphic Paris, the idea that a poem is organized violence. And I wondered about those, about that notion of saying, having those instincts and controlling them, or performing a violence, but keeping it contained in that way, and how you think about that in your work.
Again, those are very good questions. First off, I want to say that little moment in that poem where I say, I want to get it right, that it's a little moment of exposition about civilization, where no one is truly the owner of his own instincts, but controlling them. This is civilization. So probably every poem of mine has a little moment of this kind of statement of exposition, and I think a little bit of this exposition for me goes a long ways in a poem. So while after if you were scanning the poem, after the eye descriptive thing, I like to arrive at this moment of exposition. And they're kind of the hardest moments for me to arrive at. The eye descriptive thing is kind of easier, but the fresh idea that you arrive at is a harder thing for me to arrive at. And let's see, what was the second part of your question? I was going to.
Well, thinking, I guess, about the idea that, that kind of, that moment of exposition, that idea of controlling the instincts, or elsewhere you've written that a poem is organized violence.
Yeah.
I'm really curious.
I think it was Richard Howard, who was my teacher as a young man, that first said that to me. We might have been reading Sylvia Plath. I can't remember who I got that from, but I believed it. And I do think of, I think of that image of the gold cage the language is the gold cage in which there is a tiger pacing, and the tiger pacing is primary emotion, you know, fear, grief, desperation, triumph. And every good poem has to have, it has to have the organization and the violence, you might say. And there are poems that do violence, and there are poems that do organization, and they are less interesting to me. The tiger in the cage doesn't have to be, you know, doesn't have to be crazy, ravenous. It can be sleeping, but the tiger must be present.
I love that way of phrasing it, the tiger in the cage. That's amazing. When I wonder about that idea, so thinking about poems that are organized and poems that do violence. So another thing present in Blizzard, when you talk about the overwhelming feeling, I think that that's very present on a kind of visceral level. The book is full of sensation, but also this presence of the news and of the kind of like political realities of the world. The kind of whelm of that is very present. And I think that Blizzard addresses this notion of organized violence in the present political world, but also in history.
Yes.
You see in the time of the AIDS crisis, I think there's, you know, 20th century genocide is remembered. And this is, you know, this is a presence throughout this book, this very real organized violence that is happening on a large scale. And I think about something you write in the other poem in this book that was in the New Yorker, Doves, which is a poem that I love. And that poem ends, "The true spirit of living isn't eating greedily or reflection or even love, but dissidence like an axe of stone." And so I guess I wonder about dissidence in poetry and how you see the language of poetry lending itself to dissidence.
Well, I think the book Blizzard is organized in 3 parts, and the second section tends to look outward more than inward. Though again, the voice is a very private, personal voice speaking, not in any communal way. But I think that, I think it's actually healthy for the poet to feel like the poet is pushing against something. I think that is sort of like strengthening a muscle. And it's the muscle of language and the muscle of the imagination. I think there's something to be said for that. I don't, you know, whether it's a person in power, or whether or not it's concern about nature and the world, the life of the earth. I think all, you know, I don't think there's one program. I think it's important for me to have moments in which I can look outward and be public and speak, you know, speak as a solitary person against power in some way. I don't think that's unnatural. I was rereading Auden's September 1st poem this morning when I woke up. And, you know, I was so struck how contemporary, it could have been written yesterday, you know, that poem.
Yeah, it is disorienting.
It's astonishing, the insights in that poem. They speak right to the moment in which we're living.
They really do.
So, I mean, some people sometimes say that these kinds of public poems date themselves very quickly, but that's a good example of a poem that is both private and public and speaks, you know, very powerfully against power, the abuse of power.
I think that's true. And I think that that word dissidence, I think that literally comes from sitting apart. So again, we kind of return to that idea of solitude, but that there is a friction or like a pushing against something. So I think we'll go to questions from the audience in just a second, but I just wanted to ask one more thing about something else that I think maybe you mentioned Richard Howard earlier, and I think that this might also be an idea that comes from him. It's something that that you mentioned, I've seen you mention in writing before, and it's something I thought about in Blizzard, which has a strong thread of elegy throughout it as well, and about this idea that prose precedes and verse reverses, right? That prose moves in a forward going direction, and that verse is constantly kind of turning back on itself. And so I just wanted to ask about the role of memory and history in your poems, how you think about those as subjects, and maybe how they influence your thoughts about structure, your approach to structure.
Well, I think elegy is important to me. The two components of elegy that are necessary are lamentation and praise, and they are emotions that are very present in Blizzard. I think both lamentation and praise, maybe from a kind of distance, but I think the book is very elegiac.
There's also kind of a rhapsody to it as well, though, right? That it has, as you said, I think the sort of extremes of feeling.
There are very joyful moments in the book. Well, that Lingonberry Jam is meant to be one of them. It comes early in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something I thought about a great deal, in that even in the moments that are kind of focused on death and on these moments of brutality or violence, that there is such life in the poems, and the poems are so interested in life in all of its forms and all of its facets. It's something that's very active and always kind of moving and growing and changing. There are all these patterns that kind of proliferate throughout, which I find really fascinating.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have a few questions. So to make sure we get to everyone, I'm going to apologize.
Can you see them, or should I? Can you see them?
Can.
Should I look at them?
I can do it. I will ask them on behalf of people, but apologies if I get really close to the camera. So someone asks first, anonymously, have you seen a change in your writing style or writing process now that daily life has shrunk in scope?
Well, I've been writing prose. I haven't been writing poetry. So I haven't seen really any change. I think for many weeks I did nothing. I sort of organized drawers, and you know, I made myself busy. I did all sorts of things I've avoided doing for years in my apartment. But about 2 months ago, I started writing again, and I started a kind of prose project, which is okay. You know, I think it's what I'm not really. I don't want to write poems right now with the book of poems right here. I think I need to meditate for a while before.
Seems reasonable. And you've had it, and so, but the writing of the prose has continued to be capacious. And
Hannah, are you a poet? I don't know the answer to that.
I am. I do write poetry.
You write poetry?
I am a poet.
Okay.
Yes, I'm. Yes, and I would say that, I guess if I were to answer that question, I don't know. I guess I've had a lot more time to seek stimulation inside my own mind than in the outside world, and so I think I'm writing different poetry, but I don't know that it's smaller, just different.
Yes.
So another anonymous attendee would like to know what advice we might have for writers who are struggling to make their work feel meaningful in this moment. That's a great question.
To feel meaningful. To feel meaningful. I feel that the built into that question is a unfair judgment of the self, the function of writing in a moment like this. I mean, I think just to do something creative is a great triumph at this moment. You know, a small act of creativity is much more interesting than an act of power, which is, you know, what we're seeing all around us. I think don't be deceived by these grand acts of power that are really quite empty. I think creating something, I really believe, is a more profound power.
I really agree with that. I think, yeah, something is meaningful because it is true, right? Or, and I think that, yeah, you don't have to effort to make something meaningful. The meaning maybe comes first. And
maybe watch less news. That's another thing to do.
That's meaningful.
Listen to the radio less, watch less news. I've started just reading the newspaper. I somehow find the newspaper a way I can control the violence of the news more than on TV or in the radio even. I first was doing the TV, and then I moved to the radio, and now I moved to the newspaper. So
paper is the only thing I can do. I won't know about a speech unless I can find a transcript of it. Like that's the only way I encounter. So Bonnie wants to know, following up on Louise Glick's comment, I wonder if you could talk a bit about how this volume is different from your previous work.
Well, you know, that's hard for me to. It's hard for me to respond to. I mean, I'm really touched that people feel it's different. It's hard for me to decipher the differences. I hear my sentences, and I think it's true that maybe some life events have changed me, and that I have a kind of calm and observing experience, you know, that both the darker and the lighter, and maybe that's just a factor of age, you know, maybe that's just a factor of yeah, I think it's just a factor of age and some personal life events.
Do you find that usually, like when you set out to write this book, were you setting out to write a book, or does the book usually come together after, like when you have
I wasn't writing a book. No, I don't write books that way, really. I don't. It takes me 4 or 5 years, and I just write one poem at a time. I guess I'm old-fashioned in that sense. And then after 3 or 4 years, I mean, I do have binges where I write a lot, and then I have, you know, deserts when I write nothing. But at some point I sit down on the floor and I spread everything around me, and I look and see if things relate to one another, and if there's something, you know, if there's enough to think about a book, and if not, then what does it lack? Does it need a more ambitious poem? Does it need a frontispiece? Does it need, you know, I mean, I think, and then I'll go another year or two maybe. And
I think and this next question from the audience actually follows pretty nicely from that one, which asks if you could talk a little bit about your revision process, either with this book specifically or in general, and whether the revision involves taking out description or what else.
Well, I revise compulsively. I sort of do one poem at a time, or I used to do one poem at a time, and revise. I print out. I work, you know, I work with paper and pen, and until I have a page, and then I type it up, and then I, you know, I print out daily revisions until the thing is done. Very occasionally, recently, most of my poem writing has been in France, where another language is swirling around me, and where I can sort of isolate myself from a certain amount of, I don't know, coarseness that fills up everyday life. and there I can start 2 or 3 poems and keep them going over 2 or 3 weeks. But then I set them aside and then I come back. I very often send them to an editor and then I ask for them back because I want to make them better. That's a kind of a compulsion of mine, that brings about a certain amount of embarrassment, professional embarrassment, but I know I can always make them better.
Hopefully an editor of all people should understand that it can always be better.
Thank you for saying that.
And Megan wants to know, will you read us one more poem before the end of the evening? And makes a request for rice pudding and also says thank you.
I can read rice pudding, yeah.
It's a great one.
Is that okay, Hannah? Shall I read that?
Oh, please do.
Rice pudding is something I love, so that's a pleasure. Dimension though, the poem is quite dark. I saw a version of Hansel and Gretel in Paris at the Garnier with my very dear friend Claire Malroux there, and that was sort of the place this poem began, with Hansel and Gretel, though it's not at all the characters in this opera. Rice pudding. Hansel and Gretel were picking strawberries and listening to a bronze cuckoo. As the forest mist thickened, Hansel snuggled up to his little sister, admitting they were lost. They were the children of a broom maker who drank too much. They did not understand that a wife is to a husband what the husband makes her, or that even in our misery, life goes on. Squirrels play, bees forage, hemlocks bow. Sitting at the kitchen table, I eat yesterday's meat, peas and carrots, with a bowl of rice pudding. Now that you are dead, my stubborn heart lives.
I love that poem.
Thank you.
Ending, haunting.
Thank you. That last line was the last thing that I changed in the book. It was a different line. It's not important what it was, but it was the last change to the book.
Wow. Did you feel like a click that suddenly everything was in place when you made the change?
Yes, yes, it ended something.
Oh, what a great feeling. Very exciting. Well, to go to the other side of it, I guess someone else would like to know about the beginning stages of writing poems, what your brainstorming is like, whether you wait for inspiration or whether you let words roam free to organize later.
Well, I have a little magic bag here in the corner with hundreds of little pieces of paper in it that I've written down. And I mean, when I'm starting with a blank state, when I'm starting from zero, I go to that magic bag and I just start taking pieces of paper out and spreading them on the floor. And I'm looking for, I don't know, I'm like a chicken picking up a seed and putting it down, picking up another
like a magpie.
seed. Yes, I'm, until something resonates, you know. So that's sort of how I begin. There are titles of paintings, paper clippings, postcards. There are all sorts of things in there that I feel in some way that they're fecund in some way, that they might help me. So sometimes, occasionally I start that, you know, and I think I want to write a poem about this, but more and more it's not that. It's the poem, I begin with a seed and the poem kind of invents itself. The language of the poem creates its destiny, you might say, and becomes something else. And the ending is not something I know at the beginning. Unlike with I know many prose writers write toward an ending that they know, but for me, the poem is an exciting discovery of the ending, the process of writing it.
I agree. That's so interesting that it's kind of generated by these sort of currents between the languages and the sound between words. So someone asks, anonymously, as a working poet and a teacher of the next generation of poets, what is really exciting to you about how poetry is changing, or perhaps not changing, in the 21st century?
Well, I look more and more, you know, as I age and the poets ahead of me pass away, I look more and more behind me. It's funny, I don't look so much at the generation in their 40s or 50s. I look at the younger, you know, the poets in their late 20s and early 30s. I sort of know that generation more from judging and editing things.
Mm.
And they fill me with hope, actually. They fill me with optimism. When I judge something, it's very hard to choose because there's always so many more qualified, you know, so many. It's remarkable to me how many unpublished manuscripts there are, if I can put it that way. You must experience this at the New Yorker all the time.
I definitely do. I can't tell you how many poems I read that I love, and even ones that we don't. There are always more poems than there are space, and
Yes.
and yeah, it is amazing to be just to be constantly kind of introduced to all of these new voices and all of these new ways of writing that you know, I would never have thought of, and no one I know would have thought of. It's a really exciting experience. Chelsea asks, do you keep a journal or a diary? And if so, how do you use it? If not, how do you keep your words? So we know about your grab bag of words, but do you keep a more regular diary or journal?
I don't keep a diary when I'm in my regular life. My regular life, like confinement, you might say. But I mean, I do have, you know, a pile of diaries about this high from my travels and from, you know, periods when I was living abroad alone, or, and also from my encounters with some people that I felt were influencing my life. You know, they were strong, you know, strong, intelligent, sensitive mentors that were influencing my life. And I tried to keep diaries about them, you know, making entries about them, things they said, things they believed, things that I found powerful about them. And I've actually been relying on it a little bit, these diaries and this prose I've been working on.
That's such an interesting way to keep records, or to that it really is a record of these kind of significant places and people, as opposed to the kind of daily churn, I suppose.
Yes, I take lots of pictures. I was looking, you know, I take pictures compulsively, and I was looking at my phone today from March 11th, which was the day I arrived here, beginning of my confinement, and I wanted to see, you know, the pictures were a kind of wonderful, detailed account of, I mean, they were like a diary, is what I'm saying, I mean, they brought back all sorts of things that I had forgotten.
Are they digital,
so,
or do you take film ones?
I take pictures just with my phone, but I've had a camera since I was 12 years old. My father gave me one. My father was a cameraman at the TV station, and he, you know, he really gave me influenced me in that regard, and made me a picture taker. I'm grateful to him for that.
That's amazing, and to have that record. I think we probably have time for one more question. So our next question comes from Joyce, and she would like to know, are there any poems of yours that have surprised you, even frightened you after you've written them, or do you coolly calculate your every line beforehand?
I know who that Joyce is. Let's see. I think there are poems that do frighten me, and I think they are some of the best poems that I've written. I've written a few poems that I feel I couldn't publish because they frighten me so much, and maybe they'll be published, you know, long from now when I'm gone. But they, I think to be frightened by something is actually good. I say that to my students all the time, you know, because establishing the class, you know, it's so important to establish a feeling of trust so that they will write about the things that are most important to them. And sometimes they are the scariest things, you know, like a moth attracted to a flame. The trick is to write about them and survive, you know, and not be wounded.
Right. I guess this is a loaded question, but I suppose how does one do that?
How does one do that? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not a person who thinks of writing as a therapeutic process. You know, I find that the writing binds me to the emotion of the writing.
That's such a perfect way of putting it.
To the emotion of the writing, but at the same time, the satisfaction of assembling language and getting something, saying something the way you want it, is like a rope, you know, a saving rope that pulls you forward. That's my experience. That's sort of an art-making impulse thing that it's so gratifying that pulls you forward, though one is bound to the emotion maybe of the subject of the poem.
That's so interesting. And also the discomfort also being a kind of satisfaction, right? That when when you're uncomfortable, that's when you should kind of keep going, or that's when you found something interesting. Well, I think it's just about 8 o'clock right now. So I think we're out of time, but Henri, thank you so much for speaking with me and for reading to us. Thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you, Harvard Bookstore and FSG.
Thank you, Hannah.
Congratulations.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you both. I just want to thank you both, Henri and Anna, for this fantastic conversation. And thank you to all of you out there for spending your evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase Blizzard at harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and stay safe. Thank you, guys. Have a good night.
Thank you so much. Congratulations, Henri.
Thank you.